Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for coming out. We're going to do an open forum today on freedom of speech and intellectual diversity and a few other related topics. What you're going to see is the work of a committee, and like all committee works, it's not perfect, but it'll work as a good teaching tool. I want to introduce the folks that worked on this thing, just to bring you information about free speech, and then we can decide where the campus goes from here. Reggie, how do you pronounce your last name? Vandrell. Reggie Vandrell's a student that was on our committee. Scott McKay, provost, was on our committee. Dale Droege, professor, was on our committee. Mark Millage, vice president for advancement. And Joe Bottom, who is a teacher, professor here, and also he runs something called the Classics Institute, which we're building as a mad lab to investigate issues like this. We have one other person, and that's Jim Jacobson. And he sent me an email this morning. He fell on some ice.
Yeah. Where did you find ice?
I don't know. Where did he find ice? I mean, I don't understand it, but he won't be here this afternoon. So thank you for coming. We hope by the end of our time we'll have raised some issues. You'll be able to ask some questions. We'll have a conversation. That's the theory, anyway. The agenda is really very simple. I introduced the committee. Going to bring Reggie up here in a minute. She's going to go through a couple things, and she's going to play a video. I want to share with you the resource information from the Board of Regents on the issue of free speech and intellectual diversity. So there'll be some websites that I'll put up here. By the way, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, you can certainly have that. It's a little easier to click on the URLs if you have a hard copy. Just let me know, and you can have it. So, Reggie, why don't you begin and take us through the first part.
Yeah. Hello, okay.
There you are.
There we go. So our goals for this forum today, we basically just have three main goals. We want to teach and model curricular and co-curricular experiences to help the students and staff on campus understand basically our freedom of speech, how that affects the policies and how they affect the students and staff on campus. We want to support campus community and the awareness and relevance of the speech and intellectual diversity, as well as explore campus-specific policies and actions in support of free speech and intellectual diversity. So I don't know if you've heard things happening in the news recently, but there is, on college campuses around the nation, there's a war on free speech as it pertains to events happening on campus. So some people are saying there are growing intolerance for exchange of ideas at American colleges and universities. There are events that are not being held because they are too polarizing, so speakers coming to campuses fearing for their safety. There was recently a political scientist who went to speak at a college, and both him and the people who were helping promote his speech on their campus were injured in protests that were happening because of the topics that he was talking about. Students say the middle ground on campuses is a danger zone and becoming quicksand because there is such polarizing views on things that people are afraid to speak out on. And then we have a video here. So this is a video by CBS on free speech on college campuses around the nation.
Yelled at by students. At Yale University, a faculty member is yelled at by students.
It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here.
The reason? His wife, also a Yale instructor, had suggested students should be free to wear any Halloween costume they choose, even if slightly offensive. A month later, the teacher resigns.
Let me get this reporter out of here.
At the University of Missouri,
Don't push me, man.
Don't push me.
students and faculty try to stop a student reporter from covering their protest.
This is the First Amendment that protects your right to stand here, protects mine.
And at the University of California at Berkeley, when conservative commentator Ben Shapiro showed up to speak, there were multiple arrests, the school on virtual lockdown, and more than $500,000 was spent on security. Even comedian Bill Maher faced student calls to cancel his Berkeley commencement address, in part because he'd made jokes about Islam.
Whoever told you you only had to hear what didn't upset you?
But at campuses around the country, some speakers were disinvited or simply backed out in the face of student opposition. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, rapper and actor Common. It's got a lot of people asking, what is going on?
I don't agree that you, when you become students at colleges, have to be coddled and protected from different points of view.
Some of the protests are in reaction to deliberately provocative figures like white nationalist Richard Spencer.
So you don't believe in free speech at all, do you?
But what happens when the speaker says he is just reporting on his academic research?
Most of my lectures are going after them as members of a new elite that are out of touch with mainstream America.
Charles Murray is a libertarian political scientist with the American Enterprise Institute. His 2012 book, Coming Apart, explores the growing divide between rich and poor white Americans.
I think what I'm saying is important for college kids to hear.
But when he came to talk about it at Middlebury College in Vermont last March,
students and activists shouted down a man named Charles Murray who was invited to speak at the school.
Were you aware that he had this reputation that was very controversial?
Phil Hoxie, a member of the student wing of the American Enterprise Institute, helped bring Murray to campus.
It wasn't a surprise to us that some people might not like the bell curve, but we were not at all hoping that he would discuss the bell curve. We were hoping that he would give a lecture on Coming Apart.
Okay, so here we are.
The bell curve is a previous book of Murray's. It suggested race may play a part in determining intelligence. Genetics, IQ, and race. This is really the chapter.
Yeah.
And asserted that blacks do less well than whites on IQ tests. That set off a firestorm when it was published in 1994. A firestorm reignited at Middlebury.
The speakers the college invites play a key role in our mission as a college.
Senior Jeremy Albin.
And I don't think Murray's scholarship should be part of the academic mission.
It's very ironic that the students who claim to be the most liberal are the ones who are not willing to engage with controversial ideas.
Sophomore Ray Aaron was hoping to ask Murray some tough questions.
At some point, it turned into not an argument of we should protest his ideas, but we should protest his right to share his ideas.
We're going to have a great dialogue if you let us continue.
Murray was set to be interviewed by political science professor Allison Stanger.
We really lost an educational opportunity.
But seconds after they took the stage, students drowned them out with a tirade of shouts.
We didn't actually prevent him from speaking. He still wrote plenty of articles before and after the talk. It was just saying, in this specific time, on this specific stage, we're sending you a message that we do not support your ideals.
Students like Liz Dunn and Jeremy Albin insist that just letting someone like Murray be heard increases the likelihood of violence against minorities.
if you want to engage with a scholar and you believe that your right to see them and engage with them is so strong that you don't care about the potential trauma or the potential violence this could bring to marginalized students, then I think it's a pretty selfish idea of academic engagement.
I think I have the answer. You're not going to let us speak. I think that's a terrible shame.
In fact, Murray's appearance did result in violence of a different kind. When Professor Stanger was escorting Murray out, they were attacked by a mob that included outside activists, and she was left with a concussion and whiplash. Ironically, Stanger was selected to moderate the event because she was seen as a respected professor with liberal credentials.
I actually went back and reviewed the bell curve and prepared really tough questions that I never really got to ask in front of an audience that was listening. It was this real groupthink mob mentality where people weren't reading and thinking for themselves, but rather relying on other people to tell them what to think.
And it isn't just Middlebury. Murray was shouted down at the University of Michigan this past fall as well.
What do you think is different? Have students changed?
Well, the identity politics is way more intense. You are getting this, you can't talk to me about any of my life experiences because you aren't a woman and you aren't black or you aren't poor, and therefore it's almost as if they're saying we have no common humanity.
In fact, some critics say too many college campuses today aren't places for a civil exchange of ideas, but an intolerant world of political correctness. A recent Gallup poll finds that 54% of college students say people on campus are afraid to say what they believe. And if you visit a campus these days, you may feel like you need a dictionary for a whole new set of phrases. Terms like safe space, a place where students can go where they won't be exposed to topics that make them uncomfortable. Or trigger warnings, when a professor cautions students that upcoming material could be distressing. But now, some signs of a backlash.
Discomfort is an intrinsic part of an education.
Robert Zimmer is the president of the University of Chicago. Last school year, the university sent a letter to incoming freshmen that said, in part, we do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces.
Why did the university have to put out a letter like that in the first place?
Part of the way we operate is that we're a place where there's constant open discourse, constant expression, constant argument.
The letter was praised by many, but some Chicago students, including junior Mary Blair, are still debating the meaning of much of its language.
I feel like the letter represented a fundamental misunderstanding of safe spaces and their value and their importance in any kind of setting.
You know, there's a real risk aversion on these campuses.
Law student Eric Wesson.
You know, once people enter the real world, I don't think the real world is a safe space.
I can assure you that all people of color who have existed in a primarily white space know that the real world is not a safe space.
And the war of words is continuing at Middlebury, where students like Liz Dunn and Ray Aaron say the impact of the Charles Murray incident is still being felt.
Why is this a good thing, in your mind, that these protests are going forward?
I think that it's always a good thing to realize that we are actually able to challenge authority and that we actually have a voice and a place and the ability to express that, and that what we have to say and what we're experiencing is important and is something that we can change.
In the end, I think the conversation turned into whether or not we support controversial ideas. And for me, it's hands down, of course we do. It doesn't matter how much we disagree with them.
There it is. Yep, I'm gonna say something about this quote, and then Professor Droege is in charge. Recently, Joe Bottom wrote a piece in the Washington Free Beacon about free speech and intellectual diversity, expressing another opinion. You just heard a bunch of very interesting opinions in that video. I hope you heard the diversity of opinion and the tensions that are produced in some of these situations. And Joe wrote, "The failure of American colleges to promote free speech and intellectual diversity is like an open wound. It stains the imagination, obscuring passive investigation with the sick pus. It drains the vitality of thought, leaving the mind weakened, and it strains intellectual discourse, the Socratic ideal of conversation, by making us feel anxious and self-censoring." Very, very important words, which will lead us into the last half of our little presentation. So Professor Droege is going to take us through a few things. He's got some data to show us. He's got some other things that he can talk about, and we'll come back with some discussion points in a minute.
All right. Yeah. So let's say as a group, we were tasked with putting together some information. So together we put a lot of things together, and so I'm going to talk about those. I will already say that I'm not an expert on First Amendment law. We'll talk about some of those things, but they said we need somebody to get up and talk about things they know nothing about, and I said, well, that's my job description by and large. So we're basically looking for trying to find as we talk about this, some things, common interest and words and things we can go. Here we're just I gave from several different sources, Pew and the Cato Institute, some of these polls and surveys that relate to the topics that were presented in the video. For example, over here on the right, it's this idea of statements that are offensive. Should the government prevent them? Is on the orange on the left. And on the green is on the right is a government, or people should be able to say these things publicly. Basically, should there be protections for certain kinds of free speech? And the thing that there's quite a few bars there, but the thing that's probably most remarkable is the very first one with age. You can see that among young people, ages 18 to 34, there's much higher support for suppressing speech that is offensive to people, basically, that could be considered to be offensive. The kind of things that they were talking about in the panel there, that these, that students of age are concerned about being in public spaces and having things said that are offensive, and not only to them, but to maybe their friends and their colleagues. And I think if we, think that, well, we can just put a policy down that says you can say anything, anytime, anywhere, I think that's probably not something that we're willing to do. And so what we really have to discuss and think about are what are the limits and what are we willing to support on this campus. You can see that even though most people would agree that there is freedom of expression, there should be freedom of expression on campus, but even still, it's hardly overwhelming. It's still, maybe 3/4 or so, but there's still a significant number of people that are not sure that everything should be discussed. Same kind of ideas here, like say you should not, expressing political views, again, the majority should not be able to restrict, but not, 52%, 56%. These are not like, unanimous type of agreement. So there's certainly a lot of points to discuss about what kinds of things we support in those. You can see there is actually, interestingly, with some of the things that have been in the news recently, that wearing costumes and things, that's most people are very much not in favor of that. And then on the right here we have, again, the controversial speakers on campus. How do you respond to that? So in the video, I think one of the things that does trouble us some on college campuses, we're here, a speaker's giving a talk, but he's not being able to say anything. He's being shouted down, and the disruption is actually preventing that exchange of ideas. Well, again, if those ideas are controversial, some people some people would agree with that it's okay to do that. So I think you can see this on the top is, do you agree that you can shout them down, basically disrupt them with speakers? And about 20% or so think, yeah, maybe that would be, under certain circumstances, that would be appropriate. Whereas violence, fortunately, is most people are strongly against any type of violence or physical response to that. More things about hate speech. As things are, should again, about 6 out of 10 saying that that we would allow hate speech. That but again, 40% maybe speech should be not be allowed, to be prevented. And it's kind of because it's in mirror of what, not in mirror, but it's in opposition to. Most people are very opposed to hate speech. Up to 80% of people think that hate speech is something that we should not engage in, and yet, there's this split then on whether it should be prevented from being spoken or not. And then finally, can we expose, kind of some of the ideas that they were presenting, like Chicago's presenting now, this idea we do not try to limit or protect students. Even President Obama said, you shouldn't be coddled, you shouldn't be, you should be exposed to all these different things. Again, about, most people agreeing with that there should be, students should be exposed to all types of viewpoints, but again, a significant number of people thinking that is not the purpose. So there's lots of room for discussion, lots of room for, there are lots of different points of view that have to be taken into account. And as we craft this statements and policies for this campus, I think we have to take all of those into account. Anyway, we also we throw out a few questions here. There's a lot of people, we talk about the First Amendment a lot in our society, and I think there's a general understanding of it, but sometimes the nitty-gritty of it gets to be a little complicated. So threw out some questions here. You can grade yourself. First Amendment, true or false, the First Amendment protects students while they're at school. Remember, we do those and then we do the answers later. Okay, there was part of this committee thing. We had different versions of this. First Amendment prohibits public school teachers from teaching about religion in the school. And then which of the following categories of speech is never protected by the First Amendment? Indecent speech, four-letter words, obscenity and nudity. And another true-false question, protects a person's right to burn the flag as a form of political protest. So things are. So First Amendment protects students at school. It's true. Okay, there was a court case involving students wearing, I believe the one that went to the Supreme Court involved students wearing some armbands. This was in a high school. They wore armbands to school and they were asked to remove those or were suspended, and the student said this was their right, and basically the courts, could be somebody said the students do not check their First Amendment rights at the doors of the school, that they have, the schools have certain, again, it's a little more complicated. Schools have, we are educational institutions, we have certain obligations to protect that, but that does not allow you to then abridge free speech without good reason. First Amendment prohibits public school teachers from teaching about religion. This sometimes is misunderstood. It doesn't prohibit the teaching of religion, but it prohibits the establishment of religion. This idea you cannot, the Establishment Clause, you cannot promote a specific religion or particular philosophy along those lines, but you can discuss them in general. So it's not like that can't be done in schools. And then categories that are protected: speech, profanity. Those things are protected, but obscenity is not. Think of Larry Flint, I guess, back in the Supreme Court days. And of course, obscenity then, of course, has to be defined, and that has been not an easy thing to do. And then First Amendment protects a person's right to burn the flag, and that is true. There have been several congressional attempts to overturn that, but so far the court has held that is a form of political protest. One could argue the same as kneeling for the national anthem. But yes, we could. So, can a reporter be sent to jail? The government song lyrics. This was an important case. Students cannot be forced to pledge allegiance. And which category is not explicitly protected. So it actually, the doesn't campus, but say the one with the press, the reporters do have confidential information, but it is not constitutionally protected. They can be, if the judge decides that, or if the court decides that that information is not confidential and is germane to the case, they can be forced to reveal that source or face contempt of court. Government can ban song lyrics. Tipper Gore case, for those of us who are old enough to remember, things are say no. They said that those are protected. Forced to pledge allegiance to the flag, they cannot. Okay, that was a case involving Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe, back in the day that said you cannot, pledge allegiance. You cannot be forced to do that. Again, same thing with the national anthem. And what is not explicit right in the First Amendment is privacy. So assembly, religion, the right to petition the government, speech, and religion are all mentioned explicitly in the First Amendment, but the right to privacy is not. That's more of a case law kind of right. And finishing up here, which of the following categories of speech is never protected? And then kind of things are when a student is different challenges here. The student challenging the dress code, policy that prevents students from wearing flip-flop, more dress code, a protest shirt, and a personal characteristic one with dyeing the hair. And you, so the copyright infringement is actually protected by the First, or is not, I'm sorry, is not protected by the First Amendment. Okay, hate speech and all these other types of things, if they're not threatening to a person, they actually are protected by the First Amendment. And the case of the last one, sort of a case of saying that, if this one, the First Amendment would, the types of things about hair and dress and things like that would be personal. Those would not be violating a student's right to free speech. They would not be violating their right to protest. Where in this one, this student could quite likely be successful because they are being told not to wear something because it is as a form of protest. Anyway, so these were from there are several sites like this from a judicial law site, but I say they show some of the complexities of the First Amendment right, that all this is, it's always subject to interpretation from the court, and courts, have come up with various ideas, so we kind of follow those along. So for, like I say, for the time being anyway, hate speech, those types of things are constitutionally protected. So it's a little chilling sometimes. I think when we were watching that video, I always watch the beginning when the student is arguing and saying that a campus is not an intellectual space. I say that for those of us who teach, that's a fairly sobering kind of idea. So anyway, we're going to continue these discussions and forums. I guess, do we want to take any questions? Or we can probably move on, take questions later on, right?
Yeah, no, let's finish we got just a couple slides left, and then we're going to open it up. All right, you got the little clicker? There it is. Thank you. I wanted to show you where you can access information about the Board of Regents and what they've said about free speech. Up here in the corner is, we think it's the only policy that's been officially approved by the regents, but they're working on a much bigger one. Policy 3.3 in the manual, when I asked one of the vice presidents in the board office, where can we find information about free speech in the regents stuff, he gave me these two, this little box here, gave me those two references. Again, you can go out and look and see what's there. And then I wanted to summarize for you an ongoing conversation that's been happening this winter between the several members of the legislature and the Board of Regents office. It's been a very interesting back and forth, what should we call it, Pete? Dueling letters? Because they've fired things back and forth at each other. And they got fairly nasty a couple of times as they were attacking each other. summarize the concern here, there were some legislators who were very concerned about universities not allowing diverse points of view to be expressed on campus. Specifically, they were talking about the University of South Dakota and not allowing or canceling a speaker, a very conservative speaker. And they thought that was wrong, and it started this whole flurry of letter writing. I wanted to give you just a little bit of a taste of the University of Chicago piece that was mentioned in the video. It's worth going out onto the internet and taking a look at that document. It's 1 page long. It's really quite well written. I just took one small piece of it. For members of the university community, as for the university itself, the proper response to ideas they find offensive, unwarranted, and dangerous is not interference, obstruction, or suppression. It is instead to engage in robust counter-speech that challenges the merits of those ideas and exposes them for what they are. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility to not only promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it. And it goes on, it's got a couple more paragraphs. It's worth reading, and you should probably take a peek at that. I want to, again, Professor Droege found some other thoughts that we wanted to use to kind of summarize this and then engage you all in a conversation about Dakota State University. What do we want to do? Do we want to have a policy? Do we want to have whatever? So some closing kind of comments. First, institutions should adopt and invoke a range of measures that penalize conduct and behavior rather than speech. Don't punish the speech, punish the behavior, like if they're breaking windows or in the case of that one professor, they're getting assaulted by what I would call a mob. All members of the campus community should be made aware of such rules. And if we were to have such rules, we would need to have them circulated among the students, the faculty, the staff, and all of us on campus. A second point, colleges and universities should stress the means that they use best. And that is, what we do best is educate. And that's what we should be using as Professor Droege went through the materials. It's about teaching, it's about learning, and it's about understanding. So these institutions should, of course, be free and indeed encouraged to condemn manifestations of intolerance and discrimination, whether physical or verbal. A third statement, the governing board and the administration have a special duty not only to set an outstanding example of tolerance, but also to challenge boldly and condemn immediately serious breaches of civility. I think that's what the regents are seeking. I'm very sure President Griffiths would approach it in the same way. She couldn't be here today, but she's endorsed that notion of the special duty to our students and our community. And lastly, members of the faculty, too, have a major role. Their voices maybe, I think, are critical, it's not maybe, are critical in condemning intolerance, and their actions may set examples for understanding, making clear to their students that civility and tolerance are hallmarks of educated men and women. Oh, there's one more. Good. Student personnel administrators have in some ways the most demanding role of all. That's why I was hoping Jim Jacobson would be here so I could read this for him. For hate speech occurs most often in dormitories, locker rooms, cafeterias, and student centers. Persons who guide this part of campus life should set high standards of their own for tolerance and should make unmistakably clear the harm that uncivil or intolerant speech inflicts. So, where do we go from here? And this is an opportunity. We have mics for people to speak and to make suggestions. I put up a few ideas. I don't know what you want to do. Where do we want to be? Imagine tomorrow, where do you want this university to be relative to this issue? Or what are the best practices in classrooms? Are there things that we can, like for professional development for faculty, are there some things we should talk about relative to your demeanor in class? Or is there something that we need to give to new faculty when they come on board relative to how we feel as a community about free speech? Co-curricular events is really important. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee in San Francisco that day, he started something. I think he had no idea. Well, I don't know for sure, but the results have been amazing. One of the things that's very sad for me is that when he expressed that, and of course you've got the right to express it, and you've got the company and the privacy of the NFL, and I'll never defend the NFL, don't worry. I can tell you some stories about that. I won't defend the NFL, but it's a private business. It's not a university. So that makes a difference. And then the absolute freaky fact that he's unemployed. And he was shunned. Absolutely shunned. There's no doubt about it. Well, my goodness. We have a great example of some of the things that we don't like very much about ourselves and our society happening to that young man. I can't believe someone that talented didn't get picked up, but he didn't, and that's pretty obvious what was going on. Should we be developing guidelines and information from the campus for organizing speakers and events? You know, when someone, a student group wants to bring a speaker, should there be a set of expectations and rules governing that? And that's for us to decide, I think. I think that's the community needs to work on that. And then we have Dr. Bottom and the Classics Institute, who works very specifically around issues of philosophy and intellectual thought, and talks about the importance of free and open dialogue. And that's an important addition to our faculty as well. So, enough. Like Professor Droege, I could talk a lot about things I don't know anything about, but it'd be fun to have you offer some comments and observations. And Jack will be first. Please turn on the mic. It works, but it's not on.
Now it says it's on.
There,
it's on. All righty then.
Yeah, thank you.
The one thing I'd like to throw into the discussion that, interestingly, I think it's accidental, but it's interesting that it's absent from the video, from the slides, from everything, is the concept of incitement. And this is most closely associated, I'm sure many people here know, with the most famous Supreme Court case that limited free speech rights, and this was the Oliver Wendell Holmes opinion that it is not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater. And that was really going to the issue of incitement. To me, this is such well-traveled ground. You know, it seems almost like campuses are creating a problem that doesn't really exist. Everything should be allowed to be said unless it encourages people to hurt somebody or something. And so, you know, to make the example personal to me, I think anybody ought to be able to say anything they want about old white professors. Okay, anything. But if they say, if you happen to see one on campus, you should kick his ass, I think that should be limited. And so if we just set a set of rules like that, and then the other issue that I think is very important, and it goes to the Middlebury case and what Chicago was trying to do, it's not okay to ruin an appearance by a person. That had a purpose, it had a structure. I don't care if they let the protesters line the sidewalk outside and scream, "You're an idiot," to everybody who goes in, but they shouldn't be able to stop the thing from happening. That's just nutty to me.
That's wrong.
And so I don't want to make it where people can't protest or object or anything like that, because that's free speech too, but to just completely break the purpose of the thing, you know, that seems pretty weak.
Thank you, Jack. Very, very insightful comments. Incitement is very important. Another.
Kevin. Yeah, I mean, from where I stand, it's completely unsafe to talk about anything that's not the norm. Take spirituality. You can't talk about spirituality. It's completely unsafe to talk about things like that. And society is more and more saying, we don't want that. I mean, Trump is doing some good things, but he's firing people with divergent opinions. So there's all kinds of stuff like that. You take a look at the technology side, Facebook's being accused of all kinds of speech suppression. What's okay there, what's not okay there? To me, from what I read this, the safest thing to do is to not have the dialogue. And I think Jack's right. We should be able to have any dialogue we want, but the reality is, I'm scared in my class, if I'm teaching cyber ethics, to talk about spirituality. That's the reality of it. And I do all the trigger warnings, and I do take some chances, but I caveat the crap out of it, and I'm still that night laying in bed going, man, but how do you have a conversation about cyber ethics without having some element of a higher force? It doesn't have to be Christian or Buddha, right? Some level. I mean, AA deals with a higher force. So, but I'm scared about that. I mean, not just concerned, scared about that. Just this week, I was attacked for having certain opinions. I was personally attacked. Not the idea was attacked. I was physically and personally attacked. So you can't, in a campus environment right now, have divergent opinions from others. You just, so you play it safe and you back away from it all.
Thanks, Kevin. Other?
I think with Vaughn, yeah, Vaughn.
So I will say that having I think going towards the guidelines and information, I'm sorry, but I would have protested if Richard Spencer would have come to our campus. Whenever a white nationalist who believes that people who are African American are more stupid than us, than people who are white skinned because they have melanin in their skin, that is something that's not acceptable, in my perspective. But I think that for guidelines' sake, we should have, if a controversial figure is coming to our university, we should have a space and events set up so that if students feel triggered or feel hurt or feel that this person coming to them is a personal offense to them, we should have an event or something that's parallel to this that says, if you feel like if you don't want to go to this, we have this event for you. Come to this event. It can be about letter writing. It can be about contacting people to support them. It can be a myriad of things, but it's about alternating the fact. But going off of this, I think that this whole free speech thing is great, but it kind of leads me. I know this is not totally about that, but right now in the Senate, there's House Bill 122. Senate Bill 122 that would allow students to carry firearms on campus. And I wouldn't feel safe to express my feelings as an open gay man on campus and have someone say, "Oh, there have been many times on campus where I've been called the F word." And I don't want that. I wouldn't feel safe on campus to have someone have a gun and say, "Oh, well, I don't like you for your speech. I'm gonna shoot you." This is related to that issue, and I think that this is a good topic. But I think that the main thing that we have to do is we have to set guidelines. We have to set alternates that say if we're going to have a controversial figure come, we have to have alternative events scheduled and have the dialogue about that.
Just to remind you, we are recording, so I'm not taking notes. I wanted to listen, and then I can take the notes off the video. So thank you for that, Vaughn. Others? You're first, Peter.
Vaughn's touched on the legislative elephant in the room. Anytime we have these discussions about free speech, whether it's Middlebury or University of Chicago, there are lots of examples out there. Violence always seems to be on the other side of it, but I would submit to you that the opposite of free speech and divergent viewpoints is not violence, it's tyranny. There's something to fear on our campus and on any university campus as much as violence, and that is tyranny, silence, fear of speaking out the ideas that we believe ought to be invested in and opposed to those ideas we disagree with. I want to take that distinction and use it as an opportunity to encourage this campus to explore more deeply the president of the University of Chicago's statements, to explore more deeply the processes by which other university presidents, namely at marquee institutions and Ivy League institutions around the country, have rallied behind that statement, and also to thank Dale and Dick for their encouragement to get us to form some policy around how we engage in counter speech. I really like that part of what you're saying, Vaughn. And I think that the way we think about counter speech as a campus is, especially because of what landed on the front page of almost every major paper in the state this morning, really important, so that we protect our ability to engage in that kind of counter speech without having to resort to violence.
I didn't see the paper. I was curious what's on the front page. Go ahead.
So I have more of another idea to submit, and I think this goes a lot to professors, and that's within the classroom, where's the line of good discussion among students and an off-topic discussion that overall impacts the education of the other students in there, and how professors should kind of handle having students who maybe want to discuss something but want to discuss it in class where maybe it isn't the best for the topic or what the class is meant for.
So where's the line, you're saying? Yeah, that's a pretty good question. I think every professor, at least in my experience, every professor eventually finds where that is. You got it.
There's one other piece, Dick, that I think we ought to get into play, given what I've been doing here on campus. Not only the endless stream of publications that I make, but the way I've been trying to work with other faculty members to introduce them to editors around the nation and co-publish pieces with the president, with Ben Jones, with Justin Blessinger, and other professors that I'm working with to try and kind of co-publish and get this college introduced to the national press. Laura Kipnis, last year, the year before, published an article. She's a feminist professor. She published an article suggesting that sexual harassment as defined on American colleges is awkward because the human heart is a strange place, and what sexual desire was being treated as something simplistic rather than the complex emotional and psychological thing that it is. And she had a Title IX complaint filed against her on her campus for her publication. When she then wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Ed about the investigation into her, she had a second Title IX complaint filed against her on the grounds that she had violated people's rights to be free from sexual harassment for writing about the investigation into her about sexual harassment. It was an extraordinary moment, but it reminds me of another piece that we have to put into play here, which is the ability of colleges to limit speech, not just on campus. I mean, Kevin was on this, and this is why I said these policies make us anxious and fearful. But even out of campus, American campuses seem to be reserving to themselves the right to investigate you even for your publications, even for your speech off campus. And if we're going to have a robust free speech policy, it's going to have to include the ability to engage in the scholarly and intellectual discourse of the nation outside of campus.
Well, I'll take it. Vaughn, you've got the mic.
Well, I think the best way to do that, to have that discussion that's outside of campus, is to encourage more conversation with students and more conversation on campus, and I'm sorry if this offends anyone, but to have forums that aren't taken, where the first 40 minutes aren't taken up with conversation, with talking. And I think that if we had more conversation, where we had 15 minutes of a prompt or 20 minutes of a prompt and then more forum time, that would allow a better, more robust discussion. But I think that also having the discussions talked about trigger warnings and it talked about safe spaces. Both are needed on campus. Whenever you have a state like our state in South Dakota that passes discriminatory legislation towards trans kids and tries to bar trans athletes from athletics, we need safe spaces. We need places that say you are safe here no matter what. You are safe here. You will be safe in this space. You are safe here. Like the Northern Illinois University, their library was free from ICE. The library had a sign that says ICE officers. If you're going to come into our library, you have to go to the administration building first. Like it was very, very, very set in stone. And I think that we need to have safe spaces, but we also need to have trigger warnings, because if you have been assaulted or if you have had a trauma to yourself, you need and you feel like that would potentially prompt you to have a break. You should have that ability. You should have that ability to have that warning, so that if something will be triggering, or if something could happen in that class of that discussion, I think it's beneficial for the university, but it's also beneficial for the professor to say, I want you to learn in the best way possible, and I want you to give you the warning of this. This content is coming.
Okay, we got probably time for one more.
Jack in the back, and then I got maybe the guy.
I can't see, so.
Okay.
Someone's got the mic?
Yeah, Jack does. Oh, okay, here we go. Might have turned it on, sure.
Real quick, I just kind of want to bring it back. I appreciate what you've been saying, Vaughn. I'm sure everybody else has. It's been great. We appreciate your input. We appreciate everybody's input here. I'm not sure why I'm speaking on behalf of everybody, but it's kind of nice to hear from the varying opinions. I just want to kind of bring it back to a student's point of view about what Dr. Streff said and what Dr. Bottom briefly touched on, in that I think it's really important that teachers, if anything comes out of this, I think it's important that teachers don't feel restricted in what they can say in the classroom, because that does impact students. It affects our quality of education directly because of that. And I suppose that's all I was getting at, was that I would like to see less restriction on what teachers can say in the classroom.
It's probably appropriate to end with a student comment, but we can squeeze one more in. Thank you very much for that.
So I was going to be along those same lines as far as the spirituality speak and things like that. It's a very important part of one's life to have, in my humble opinion, it is important to have a belief in something greater than yourself. It doesn't matter whether or not that's some sort of spiritual religious aspect, or if it's science is the ultimate thing and you believe wholeheartedly in that, and that is fine. But the allowance of alternative perspectives is the piece that is often missing in those conversations. I'm not saying that every professor on this campus should engage in a religious or spiritual conversation. That is not, if you aren't comfortable with your own, then how can you be comfortable with anyone else's? And how can you not try and force folks into seeing things from your side of the coin, whatever. The biggest problem that I ever had in undergrad, graduate school, anything like that, was a Native American religions course where the Christian side was allowed to speak their mind, and then things got uncomfortable, and the professor was woefully unprepared to teach this class and shut the conversation down. So the allowance of the other perspective is not allowed. Now, I understand that topics get touchy, emotions run high, and folks want to scream and shout and all that sort of stuff, and I get that, but at the same time, this is a classroom and a place where we are supposed to have these perspectives. We are supposed to have these conversations. So it is incumbent upon the students themselves to self-regulate somewhat. And that's the biggest piece that I feel is missing. I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with safe spaces, but I'm of the ilk that we should have safe spaces with teeth, where not only the student who has been offended needs a place to go, but the person who did the offending also needs to be shown why this was offensive. This is how your speech hurts people. This is the perspective that you are trampling upon. And we don't have those spaces. We don't do enough investigations. We don't do enough code of conduct things. I'm not saying everybody should get kicked off campus, but everybody should be given the opportunity to see where they erred. And we don't do enough of that in a lot of places on this campus. So.
Thank you. And you have the last word.
Check.
So trigger warnings often get a bad rap amongst vehement free speech advocates like myself, but I actually think that trigger warnings can be used in service of free speech if we use them correctly. One of the things that's great about free speech is that if you don't like what I'm saying, you don't have to listen. You can change the channel if you want to. And I think that we already have trigger warnings in the form of MPAA guidelines for movies or ESRB ratings for video games. And so I don't see anything wrong with having a little paragraph on the copyright page of a book that lists a few topics that might be potentially offensive or uncomfortable to people, in exchange for those people revoking their right to complain about it because they had the opportunity not to listen. And there's definitely something to be said for not coddling students, but exposing people to uncomfortable ideas needs to be done consensually. If you want to help me get over my fear of spiders, you don't do that by pouring a bucket of tarantulas on my head. So while the term trigger warning itself has kind of turned into a joke in recent years, and it's definitely a slippery slope, I do think that giving students and anyone in general a heads up as to what they might be getting themselves into could actually help free speech.
Okay, thank you. I invite you to continue the conversation if you wish. We need to end the formal part, and I want to warn the committee, I will be calling you back into session so we can follow up and decide what the next steps are. So be prepared for that as well. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it. Huh?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this is good.
What was it?
They want to
limit